Everyone, my name is Aaron. I'm with Connected Real Estate. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of the Connected Real Estate Tech event. Really appreciate you guys joining. For those who are not with us live, thanks for coming back and watching on demand. Great sessions lined up for today. We're kicking off the morning with our how do public safety systems fit into the in-building ecosystem. And again, want to thank our sponsors for the day. And our exhibitors. Please take a minute and go through the booths, enjoy time going through the chat, and enjoying the platform. Laurie, I'm going to kick it off to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. A little bit different, not being on stage. My name is Laurie Caruso. Welcome to the public safety panel. How does a public safety system fit into the in-building ecosystem? My name, again, Laurie Caruso, and I work for a company, SafeBy Technologies, and we consult and solve pain points for public safety. I'm going to actually have my panelists introduce themselves. We'll start off with Kern Davis.
Thank you, Laurie, and thanks all for being here today to support this. My name is Kern Davis. I'm with Communication Technology Services. We've been around since 1990, and we have designed, built, and we continue to maintain thousands of DAS systems around the United States. I'm VP of Business Development and Consulting Services, and really started focusing my efforts on the new public safety codes about 2.5 years ago. So I'm leading the team nationwide in trying to understand that and working with all of the stakeholders to understand that better.
Excellent, thanks, Kern. Rich Fann.
Hi, thanks, Laurie. Good morning, everybody. My name is Rich Fann. I'm an associate in the DAS RF engineering group for Baum and Bowles. JB&B is a multidisciplinary engineering firm, and we're located in New York City. I've been in the RF engineering field for a little over 39 years. I specialize in public safety radio and public safety distributed antenna systems, and I've been working with the public safety indoor systems for roughly 20 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Gary Gray.
My name is Gary Gray. I'm the radio systems manager and communications coordinator for the city of Fort Lauderdale. I've been at Fort Lauderdale for over 20 years, and so years ago we've started putting BDAs in way before the NFPA and other regulatory agencies became involved. So we've been doing this for quite a while. I enjoy what I'm doing, but I don't enjoy this coronavirus stuff.
No, it's definitely challenging at best. Thank you. Kevin Kurz.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Laurie. Pleased to be on the panel this morning with everyone. I am the wireless business manager for Anixter. Been with them for about 8 years. I've had the privilege to be hired with Cellular One back in the mid-90s. And had the ability to launch Cellular One, AT&T, as well as T-Mobile before moving back east to get involved in in-building in 2006. So very, very pleased to be with you. Anixter is actually a global logistics and supply chain services company that does distribution extremely well. And I've been focused on public safety now for a number of years, trying to work in key verticals to make our first responders safer.
Thanks, Kevin. And lastly, Ed.
Hi, my name's Ed Zaldivar, and I'm with Comba Telecom. Comba is a manufacturer of BDA and fiber DAS equipment, along with filters and things like that. I've been in the industry for quite a while now. In the last 10 years, I've worked for manufacturers, as well as having worked as a systems integrator. So I have that knowledge to bring to the table as well.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. So as you can see, we have a great panel lineup here talking about this public safety piece. It's very passionate for all of us. I want to get started, and I think it's important to note what the differences are between the traditional systems, what we see and what we hear. Rich, if you could kick this off and give us a little bit of insight about, emergency responder radio communication system, traditional BDA versus, I know we hear a lot about FirstNet. Maybe you can give us an example and tell us what those two and how they differentiate.
Sure, absolutely. And Laurie, you know, with everything in technology, every statement we make is going to have, you know, about 100 caveats to it. So more than we can really hash out here. So I'm going to just kind of stay in the terms of what is typical. An emergency responder radio coverage system, or an ERRS system, or ERRCS, as you'll see I'm referred to. It's typically a system that receives and retransmits radio signals to and from the AHJ's radio site from within the building. You'll hear this referred to a lot as using donor signals or a donor site. It's typically a voice application in the VHF, UHF, 700, 800, 900 meg frequency bands. And these are the systems that are deployed with BDAs, picking up signals over the air. And their systems are mandated by current codes in most municipalities. On the FirstNet side, FirstNet's focus is primarily a broadband data network for first responders. AT&T is deploying the FirstNet network, and I think the last I saw they were around 60% complete with that network. And their initial focus was to deploy FirstNet in a dedicated 700 megahertz band referred to as band 14. However, AT&T is making FirstNet available across all of their different frequencies to aggregate bandwidth, so people or the public safety has more bandwidth to work with. FirstNet does have some voice capabilities, but it's really intended to be a complement to the land mobile radio systems, not as a replacement. With FirstNet utilizing the standard LTE cellular technologies, for lack of a better term, to deliver their service, and considering the frequency bands that they operate on, you know, I would expect to see this more and more being supported by the cellular DAS systems. FirstNet is not currently required in most codes. There are some municipalities who have included it, and I imagine there's going to be more to come. Thanks, Laurie.
All right, thank you. So that brings up another great point too, as far as the systems that are in the building. And I'm curious, Gary, so I know what are the main differences between the fire alarm panels that we see in these systems? What are the differences there between the emergency responder systems?
Well, the fire alarm system for the building is really intended to notify the occupants in the building that there's a fire event occurring. The AirAct system is used exclusively by the responding agencies to facilitate their communications while they're in the buildings, so that they have the ability to talk among themselves as well as back to their dispatchers. So it's more of a system for the responders than the building occupants, but it's important that they be there.
Okay, great. So Kern, I'm curious. Obviously, we hear about the FirstNet piece. Are there any municipalities or first responders that might shy or use the FirstNet system versus maybe the traditional BDA? Do we see any of that? Like fire, what are they using?
Well, Laurie, that's a great question. We are certainly, when we're building and designing our system, one of the requirements is that whatever we put in is supposed to be able to scale and be able to evolve into that next technology and be able to support it. So we do get that request frequently. However, to date, we have not encountered, and we are, again, nationwide in our efforts, we really haven't encountered any authority having jurisdiction, one of the fire marshals out there, asking us to actually deploy the FirstNet system in building. Right now, from what I understand, that has primarily been an outdoor deployment, and that is how it is being used. But we do hear that there are municipalities that are beginning to embrace that, and we are talking about that right now. But we do have a lot of questions about what that's really going to mean and how we're going to do that.
Okay. So I know code enforcement is a big piece to this. Obviously, you know, in certain areas and jurisdictions, they might interpret code differently in one specific area versus the other. Kevin, I'm curious also, why is it that codes are different, maybe in California versus what we're seeing in Broward County in Florida?
Right, exactly. So great question. You know, the code bodies of the International Fire Council, as well as NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, they have the codes, but the states are allowed to enforce and recognize different versions. You know, they don't always look at both of them. So they're technically recognized as the standard, but inside these codes, there's room left for local jurisdictions to modify and enforce as they see fit. So one thing you'll see from this panel, and Rich had already talked about the word caveat, we look at the word "it depends" quite a bit, not only from venue to venue, but the codes are open to interpretation for the local AHJ to kind of interpret and enforce certain things. Like down in Miami-Dade, you know, they're looking at conduit and protection of the cable, where other AHJs might be looking more for the ability to protect the cable from a standpoint versus fire. So that's what really makes a difference. So as a in-building public safety integrator, it's very important that you understand the venue, where it's located, and get very good coordination going with the AHJ so that you know what's important to that particular agency.
Okay, thank you. So with that, I mean, I see, you know, obviously there are certain spots across the country that are very hot when it comes to public safety, whether it's installing public safety or proving public safety exists for communications in an existing structure and obviously new construction. Rich, can anyone install public safety? I mean, can you just have a contractor call somebody up and say, hey, I need a public safety system installed? Can anybody do that?
Yeah, you know, this is a great question, and it's an important one, and it creates a bit of a dilemma for us today. And I'll say my comments on this on this question. You know, our two integrators that are on the call here with us, they don't fall into this group. They're qualified individuals, but you know, considering the public safety systems are mandated, there's a high demand for services, and it's growing. And with the demand, there's many companies that are seeing an opportunity to, you know, be involved in an additional service sector. The problem is, from what we see from our standpoint, there's a shortage of qualified companies, and it's creating a situation where they're not particularly qualified companies are out working on some of these public safety projects. And that's a bit of a concern. I understand people wanting to get into the business, and we certainly need people to, but it needs to be done correctly. The ERRCS, it's a life safety system, and it's really not a field somebody should be dabbling in. Mistakes in design, missing code requirements, poor performance, causing interference, all of those things put first responders and building owners and even the contractors at risk. If the system isn't accepted by the authority having jurisdiction, in many cases, they can't occupy the building. Mistakes can be costly, but they could even be more deadly if the system's relied on and it's not available. But we see many companies that have successfully deployed and installed wireless and cellular DAS systems. They might not exactly understand all the nuances and all the complexities of first responder, particularly in those VHF and UHF frequency bands. From a design perspective, if you're entering this sector, and if there's terms like time domain interference, intermodulation, cascading noise figures, faded audio calculations, occupied bandwidth, filter envelope delay, you know, there's a ton of them. But if those things are foreign to you, you need to really step back and enlist the help of some experienced RF designers. You can add an RF engineer to your team with two-way radio experiences, although they're pretty hard to find right now. Or you can partner with a company that can offer you these services. I know that there's integrators that turn to the manufacturers for design services. They're fantastic resources. However, there's different levels of design that come from them, and you need to really make sure what you're getting. You know, sometimes they're model designs or standard designs. Sometimes they're preliminary designs that need to be modified for the property that you're working on. And sometimes there's portions of the design that are left to the integrator. So ask those questions and, really understand what you're getting in terms of a design from the equipment manufacturers. And from an installation point, I think, a company that has coaxial and fiber installation and testing experience and coverage testing experience, they can be trained to do the deployments. So, last thing I'll say on this, if you're planning to get into this sector, the public safety sector, do the homework. Make sure you have qualified personnel. It's critical for the first responders that are going to rely on these systems in an emergency event.
I'd also like to add that these systems are an extension of the public safety radio system, and they do have to be put in correctly because it has a major impact if they're not.
You bet.
We're going to get to that for sure, Gary, no question. And, when I'm consulting property owners on just this, it goes back to the property owner from a risk perspective, does it not, Gary? Ed, how does that work as far as if there happens to be tragedy and it's proven that the communication fails? Now the property owner's thinking they've got a great system and it's working properly because they hired somebody off the street. What happens though to the property owner in risk, Ed?
Yeah, no.
I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer that one.
Thanks, Gary.
I'm going to take a shot at it. I don't have my legal certificate anywhere near, but as well. But no, it's important to note when talking about, for example, from the point of view of a new construction, from the very beginning, it's made very clear while the permits are being applied for, et cetera, that the ultimate responsibility, I don't want to say liability, but the ultimate responsibility is for the owner of the building. So you can have, and here's the reason why that is. Imagine that you're the building owner and you go out and you ask a couple of these integrators to provide you a quote, and one integrator provides you a quote that's very, very low, and another integrator provides you a price that you think is needlessly high. Well, it could be that one person has no idea what they're doing or minimal ideas, may not have even visited the site, and just you sent him some floor plans and he's using his tools to come up with some kind of rough order of magnitude for you, and you accept that as a firm quote. You've obviously undermined what a proper installation should be. I won't, speak in front of Gary about how some systems, and we've had issues here in Florida that have been terribly costly, and Gary can talk about that as well. But the bottom line is that the responsibility falls back to the property owner, and it's up to them to make sure that they hired a company that not only has the authority from the manufacturer to do the installations, but is also technically capable of understanding what the requirements are for an ERCS system.
Yeah, very good. So getting back to the codes, Kern, why is it so important that we follow these codes to begin with?
Well, it's a bit of a two-part answer here. Obviously, the codes are still reasonably new if we look at how old sprinkler codes are and how many revisions they've been through. They get renewed every 3 years. And so in our world, those codes really came into play, and Gary, correct me if I'm wrong here, but initially about 2009. But we've been through about 3 different publications now with regard to the new codes. And they're getting better and better and better each time. But the initial ones, they were the first shot at putting these out here. And the reason we've got a lot of good people like Gary out there who are helping us at the fire protection side of this, or the first responder side of this, is because there's a lot to be interpreted and a lot to be understood. That's why you, Laurie, are out consulting. That's why I'm out consulting. Kevin, all of us, that's probably the biggest job we can do right now is get out and educate. But at the end of the day, the codes are there to make sure that these systems are available to the first responders when they enter this building. And the only reason they're entering that building is probably to save us. So why is it important to follow the codes? Well, because, you know, usually lives are at stake for one reason or another. They're entering a building and they're doing that for us and to take care of us. And the codes are there to make sure that their signal is available to them throughout 100% of critical areas, 95% of the rest of the areas, and that they stay up and available even in those critical moments, be it fire or active shooter or anything else. So that to me is the reason that we need to be following these codes. As to what those codes mean and how they get interpreted, back to Kevin's question, we see a lot of variation in that, even within the same counties. And that's the piece where more education is going to help us.
And why it's so important, again, as you've mentioned, to talk to the authorities. So getting to the authorities, we do have Gary on here as well. So Gary, I know that property owners, when they're told that they need to put the system in, where do they start? What do they do? And where should they go to do that?
Well, I really recommend that they start with the radio people for the radio system that's being used in their particular jurisdiction. Those are the people that have the final authority to approve or disapprove that system. So you need to know what their requirements are going to be so that you can build that system to meet those requirements. And following the radio people, then your local fire marshal, he's the one that's going to do a lot of the testing, or his people will do the testing and sign off on making sure that it meets all the codes. The electrical inspector is involved, mechanical inspectors are involved. These are really construction projects. They're not something that you just slap up on the wall and run a piece of wire from point A to point B. They're very complex systems that need to have the engineering behind it to design it. And you need the right people to guide you in that process. Unfortunately, not every fire marshal is well versed in RF technologies, and it's kind of rare, actually. And so you need to get a hold of the people that do have that knowledge and expertise at the get-go, right from the beginning. Talk to the radio people first, then talk to the fire marshal, your building department. They can all guide you. And now that this has become more mature, there's more documentation out there. There's more code elements being written to cover the various aspects of these systems. So it's getting a little easier for the construction people to put these systems in. But again, number one, get a hold of your radio people, because they're the ones that can give you the best guidance technically.
I want to add real quick, if I can, Laurie.
Yep.
And Gary brought something up that I want to piggyback on a little bit, and that is the codes are evolving, and I brought it up as well. So when you start talking about the 2015 or the 2018 version of IFC, or the 2016 or the 2019 version of NFPA, one of the things you'll see CTS do, and I'm sure you do as well, is really want to get in and talk to that AHJ, because in our world, technology moves so rapidly. And because these codes are changing really in the improvement of what the code should be. And so we find, unfortunately, that a lot of jurisdictions are still hanging on to probably just more of a training issue, just getting it looked at and understood and accepted. But you can move within a state, within a county, within the country, and see maybe 1, 2, or even 3 iterations of that code behind. These guys can be as much as 3 codes behind, or 3 versions behind. And that's very difficult to work with. The newer codes are the better codes, and they address all the issues the previous codes really were at fault over. And that's the piece that active conversation with the AHJ can really help smooth out and smooth the path for a more complete and a more reliable solution.
Great.
Building on that, the AHJ has the authority to allow you to use a newer code version if you choose to, but you need to get that permission up front in advance before you start your design project. And also be aware that there are some elements in the newest versions of codes that are going to be a shock to you. And that comes as far as lightning protection and grounding.
More to come on that. So Kevin, I'm a new building owner. I'm installing or I'm building a building. Do you think, I mean, what are the chances that I'm actually going to have to install a public safety system? Do all buildings need this?
Yeah, that's a great question. The simple answer is, all buildings, don't necessarily need a public safety DAS. However, the code calls for all buildings to be tested. So some will absolutely pass. It's real important to note that if your macro signal is worse than neg 95, you're not going to be required legally to put in a public safety DAS system. But as you go through working with a really qualified DAS partner, testing early and often, being able to get into that facility and do a professional grid test to make sure you can take the readings and see how much of the building is actually going to fail will allow you to understand what needs to be done. It was about maybe 6-8 months ago, I got a call from a radio manager in one of the Southeast states, and he made a comment that he had 27 schools and he wanted quotes for all 27 schools. And it was really easy for me to just give him a little bit of education and tell him that, there's a very good chance you're not going to have to put 27 public safety DASs in. And what you really need to be asking me for is a grid testing, for all 27 schools. So I introduced him to 3 integrators that could give him quotes to come and do those site surveys, and they only needed about 13 schools to be done. So that's real important because the end building owner really doesn't have a good feel for RF. They don't know what it's going to cost them. So we really want to test and see what is actually going to be needed.
That's a really great point. Thank you for that. So now I'm faced with having to put a public safety system in. I also want to put a DAS system in, a carrier DAS system, because I know I don't have reception in the building based on the fact that it's a lead building. Ed, can I run it off the same network? Would that be okay for me to do?
As far as the infrastructure, yeah, and I'm sorry?
Carrier DAS and public safety, do they work well together?
Yeah, they're completely different systems. I see Gary shaking his head already, and in my area, in the area that I work, I don't know of a single AHJ that allows both systems to be structured, combined. I think this question comes about because, well, some of the equipment like the service antennas are capable of a large range of frequencies, and maybe that brings about the question. Also, as you said, people reaching for their cell phones to make an emergency call within a building brings up the idea, well, I not only need public safety, but I need cellular coverage as well. But you need to keep the systems separate. The design elements of either system are disparate. That you need more antennas for a cellular coverage, say, than you would with public safety. Public safety requires very strict grid testing, as was mentioned before. It needs to, abide by the way the code and the AHJ set the rules forth. And it's really something that the majority of AHJs are going to ask you to shy away from.
And I'd like to also add that when you're putting in a carrier DAS network, you have to have the prior approval of that network owner. You have to go to the AT&Ts, you have to go to the Verizons, you have to get their approval. And they have specific equipment they want you to use. And that's not always compatible with the public safety. Plus there are some interference issues between the various public safety bands and the various cellular bands.
And while we also have to get permission from the local radio managers for a public safety system, that's a requirement as well. There's some very practical, economical reasons you don't want to combine these two together. When you start talking about battery backup requirements for public safety, that is not inexpensive to do. and hardening, as Kevin brought up, whether it's just hardening the cable from physical damage or it is hardening the cable for a 2-hour, 1850-degree fire. That is a very expensive proposition. So if you're talking about combining these two systems, you might not find the economics of it really save you much money. It actually probably is much better on from every perspective to create two different systems. With the one exception could be sharing some fiber infrastructure in the building. Even within that, that's based on your local AHJ and what he will allow.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we do talk about how are there ways to reduce the cost given the fact I do have to have an individual system for public safety. Now, Gary, you're out there, you're seeing this firsthand, and you have to approve it. When you go into these buildings and you're testing, I mean, typically, and I always say this, from a carrier desk perspective, you're usually going where the crowds are. You want to be able to give that reception in that area, and you're designing accordingly. But from a public safety standpoint, you're designed differently. You're designing in areas where people will go if they need to run away, like stairwells, elevators, basements, bathrooms, and such. Now, when you're out there and you're testing and you're trying to, their property owners trying to reduce cost and such, you must see or have some examples of what could go wrong and how it could be so costly if they don't have it installed properly the first time.
Oh, I have all kinds of horror stories about improperly installed BDA networks. And typically the biggest thing that happens is they will take a public safety radio system off the air. We've had that happen in Dade County. That also came up and impacted the Broward County radio system at the same time. We've had it here in the city of Fort Lauderdale. A system was turned on and it impacted both the city's radio system and the county's radio system. And they've got to be installed correctly. Now, the systems really don't work well when they're combined with public safety and the cellular stuff. As Kern said, their design parameters are totally different. We have different requirements, and we don't want to see those things put together in the same network.
Yeah. Okay. And you had an example too, as far as getting it right. When you're going in there and you're testing and you're saying to the individual, okay, we need to make sure that this area here where the stairwell is, that story that you were telling me about, what happened in that instance with that property owner? And what could have happened? And maybe you can give a little bit of an example of what you were up against and what could have changed. Tell that story.
Well, this was a new building, and we had gone through and done the initial testing and found that one of the stairwells that was in this structure, and it was about a 20-story building, did not have adequate coverage within the stairwell. So we went back to the building owner and the BDA installer, sat them down, we had a conversation, and they agreed that they would have to install in that stairwell. Well, they did core drilling in a stairwell, put in conduit, put in all the antennas, called us back, and when I went through my notes and looked, went to the stairwell that my notes indicated, there was nothing in that stairwell. So we went to the stairwell that the BDA installer said, hey, this is the one we put it in. It was the wrong stairwell. So now they have to go back, core drill the correct stairwell, take the time and effort to reinstall everything. And we told them, don't take it out of the other stairwell because that's not time and money well spent. But put it in the stairwell you should have put it in. And we went forward with the testing from that point, and they finally passed. But mistakes like that are expensive for the building owner. They're expensive from a time standpoint. He was pushing to get his certificate of occupancy, and he was up against the wall trying to get his building finished so that he could move on with his life. And those kinds of mistakes are not pleasant. I don't know what else I can do, but I have some stories of interference caused that are just nasty.
Yep, when we see this, you know, they're faced with timing issues. In order for them to receive occupancy permitting, they have to be able to install this quickly. So they're up against timing issues, but they're also up against cost. So it's important and imperative to get it right and get it right the first time. Now, Kern, we see RFPs coming out for these installations. I'm curious, are you seeing RFPs like I am, not completed the right way, and there's so many different things that need to be changed? And what happens when you see an RFP that's not complete?
Yeah, I mean, so we're usually talking about either we got an existing building, or even more risk and more problematic is brand new building. But in both cases, something that's still, you know, if you're lucky on paper, they're designing it, and you might have some CAD drawings you could work to. But nonetheless, the approach is one where you get an RFP that's very general. We're really not getting a design. They're relying on everybody who gets this RFP to actually put together some kind of design, and then put a bid together based on that design approach that they're going to take. Now, I'm a general contractor, and I've built a lot of commercial buildings. I have never, ever built a building for somebody without having a set, or gotten an RFP, without getting a set of actual designs with all the construction specifications and everything involved. So I've always argued that I'm not so sure that that approach is really a good one. And certainly when you get, as the owner, and you're receiving the RFP responses back, there should be something that goes off in your head that says, wait a minute, I'm getting responses that are maybe 500 or 1,000% apart from each other. How can that possibly be? Well, it can be because you know, I was always taught, if you get that kind of response back on an RFP, you wrote a bad RFP. And, you know, so I really think it's back to that education piece we were talking about, Laurie, and that is that you've got engineering groups and architects and building owners and building management groups, you know, and it's really a process that goes counter to what they're used to. If they're trying to make a decision about buying a piece of property, even, they want to know what a budget is. A lot of them, they don't want to go back to the bank and say, I need more money. And yet, this system is one that we really can't define 100% from a design standpoint until we get this building up to a certain point, and we can really go in and definitively measure it. So what we have to do, based on code requirements from a measurement standpoint and solution design, is counter to their desire as a developer or building owner in naming that tune budget-wise before they ever buy that piece of property. So the earlier they can get a consultant on board, the earlier we can get in and start helping them understand what the needs are. I'll go back one farther. Kevin mentioned if it's an EG 95, or if it isn't an EG 95 on the ground, they don't have to put one in. He didn't say on the ground. Brand new construction, all I have is on the ground to measure. But if I get back to that building when it's 10 floors in the air and that 10th floor is up above all the surrounding clutter, I might have an EG 90, or I might have an EG 85 up there. What's the code say there, Gary? I got an EG 100 on the ground, but I actually could put a system in that building now because at the 10th floor, I have a usable signal. So,
well, that brings up several issues. The first one of your comments that I want to address is the fact that we have seen building owners put out an RFP that was designed by company A, and they're expecting installers and integrators to come in and install to that design. And a lot of the integrators and installers are saying, no, we're not going to install to this design. We're not comfortable with this work. We want to do our own design so that we get it right, because we're going to be held responsible for the performance. We want it to be our design, not somebody else's design that may be inaccurate.
Well, that's a very valid point, and it really, to me, speaks to really a lack of certification programs and training programs, even at an engineering level, an installer level, right? And there's so much to be done here when you look at what NICET provides to the sprinklers groups, and in terms of training and certification programs and NICET certification. You know, there's a lot of that needs to happen in ERRCS so that, you know, when you call somebody, you've got qualified people. design-wise or installation-wise.
Training
agree
and
completely,
certification
yeah.
is way behind the where it needs to be.
Right.
Absolutely. So I'm getting, and this is new for me, seeing some questions come in. I do want to get to these questions. I think they're important from the audience. So if there are any other questions, please send them in. I'm going to go ahead and ask some of these questions for now, and I'll let whoever step in just do it, but as long as we're not talking over each other. So one of the questions I have, are they still seeing a lot of UHF, VHF for ERC systems?
Yes.
Hey, Laurie, this is Rich. I can tell you that we do at JB&B, particularly UHF is the fundamental frequency still without, throughout New York, and it's pretty commonly used across the United States. So we see an abundance of UHF, and we do encounter VHF, and they're still in use, and VHF might be the most difficult band to design for in-building services, and let somebody else jump in if they want to.
No, we're seeing the same thing, Laurie. And interesting to be designing a VHF, UHF system and be told, make sure it will accommodate FirstNet, which, might be at 2100 megahertz. I'm like, yeah, okay, we'll pull an extra strand of fiber.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So another question that came up, are there certifications that an integrator must have in order to install and design these buildings?
This is
Well,
Rich again. I'll jump real quick. I know that there's a focus in the industry to determine what that certification is. There are some out there that you see, primarily from the municipalities have adopted the GROL, the FCC GROL, which is the General Radio Operator license. Not sure that's the most, even though I have that myself, I'm not sure it's the most applicable to what's going on. But they also talk about, different levels of certification. You have to have the GROL, you have to have went through certification training with the OEM that produced the equipment, if they make that available. And in some cases, they may have third-party requirements to review and approve the design data. There's others out there I know that are being worked on. NICET is one. There's a couple of different programs. The one that was more applicable for me to our business is the NARTI, which is the National Association of Radio, Telephone, and our Telecommunications and EMF Engineers. So, that covered quite a bit of the type of RF that we actually work on a normal basis. But I don't know if anybody else knows of one that's more standard than the GROL across the United States just yet.
There really isn't, and one of the things that I look for and haven't really seen a lot of, but there are a few out there, is an amateur radio license. If they have an amateur radio license for several years, have used it, have worked with amateur radio, done some propagation work in that field, played with the radios, they know how they're going to work. The GROL is nice, but it doesn't give you experience. It's a test that you can take, and they're fairly easy to pass. But if you're actually working in the field, working in a radio shop, designing radio systems, putting them in, seeing how they perform, and that's where the amateurs shine, because they do all that. That's what I prefer to see. Now, there are other testing agencies out there that are working towards getting a test for the installation and for the design. State of Florida is actually looking at creating an electrical license that is geared more towards bidirectional amplifier installations. I was working with them on that testing program. Is it perfect? No, but it's a start.
Just jump back on that with, to reinforce what Gary is saying about the amateur radio. A lot of people overlooked that, thinking that, it's an amateur radio license, so it's not applicable to business. But I can tell you, holding a general license myself, that it's very applicable to what you're doing today. It's the same radio systems in essence, the same radio systems that are being used by the responders, up to and including, newer DMR radio systems. So it's an opportunity for us to get, like Gary said, get our hands on them, see them from the inside out, and get a chance to see how they really work.
From the perspective of, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, from the perspective of a manufacturer, we do want to make sure that the majority of the people that are installing our products have and pass our certification training courses. This all comes about because what do you have in the installation of an ERCS system? You've got a local contractor, and that contractor has an electrician that's working on the site, and they are now told that they're going to have to add conduit in order to assist in the installation of this ERCS system. And they say, well, why shouldn't we be in that business? We're having to connect here to the fire alarm panel. I'm a fire alarm company. Maybe I can do the same thing. It's not that you can't. It's just that RF knowledge, RF propagation
expertise.
Exactly. You're lacking the expertise, and you either need to partner up with somebody that has the expertise in order to do proper installations, or you need to get someone on board that has that expertise. It's very important.
All right, I've got a couple more questions here too, so I want to make sure I get to them. There's and I don't want to stop you, but let me ask this other questions just so we can do it. Kern, were you going to say something? Now let's go to you.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Because you keep getting cut off, and I know this is difficult. Are you sure? I'm going to give this one to you. Are you ready?
I don't know.
Right. This question, when it comes to public safety BDA RF reuse, what is the process when the public safety frequencies are repeated in such a way that the public safety signal has a lot of noise coming into the donor antenna that feeds a new public safety DAS?
What is the process?
I know, Kern, I'm putting you on the spot on that one.
No, that's okay. I mean, so you're going to get a report usually from the local municipality, at least a lot of areas where we're working in. We talked about measuring that signal when you're done. There are a lot of municipalities now where we're actually required to use that same group to go measure it at the beginning to see if you need it. Whether they do it or whether we do it, we really need to be looking at what that background noise floor looks like. That neg 95 in a noise floor of neg 92 is not a good enough signal, even though it might eke by that neg 95 signal level. So that's part of what we're looking for. We've seen codes change recently where they're talking about not necessarily that neg 95 receives strength and go more toward a delivered audio quality, a DAC of 3.0, which in our commercial world of DAS really speaks more to signal to noise. I hope I'm answering your question, Laurie. So, so really that is something we've always been trained to look at. Kind of back to
one of the things that,
Kern,
one of the things that could cause a noisy signal to go into that BDA network would be the wrong donor antenna. If you have a simulcast public safety radio system and you're pulling signals in from multiple sites, you're going to have timing differences between those sites and your BDA site, and that's going to give you all kinds of noise and problems. So proper design, again, you have to know what you're doing.
Absolutely. And one of the questions that we need to ask our AHJ is obviously, where are those towers? What frequencies are on what tower? We don't, sometimes you've got police, fire, and EMS all on one tower. Sometimes they're on 2 or 3 different towers. And by the way, those are not the only public safety frequencies that we are required to use. Every once in a while, we've got FBI and Homeland Security, depends on where we are and what we're doing. So if they're on 3 different towers, that could be 3 different donors. If there are multiple towers to choose from, we might have a preferred tower they want us to use, but we might find, for Gary's comment, and for that reason alone, that we have to go back and say, that's too noisy. We really need to go to this one, a little farther away, but a little more isolated. But then that feeds to that delay problem then indoors, right? Because we got to make sure that we don't have so much delay for that guy who's going to receive both the indoor signal and the outdoor signal, that his radio sees too much noise and at a radio level or a user level has a problem. So
Well,
there's
that
a lot
delays
of
in
considerations involved.
microseconds. That delays in microseconds, and as long as the indoor signal overpowers what's coming in from outside by at least 16 dB, it shouldn't be an issue.
First
Next
time I heard
question.
16 dB. First time I heard 16 dB in the commercial world, it's 8 to 10. So, but that is the piece that we all have to be constantly looking at. And again, how are you qualifying the guy you're asking to give this system to you? Does he have that kind of experience? Has he been doing this?
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Another question that I have is Fort Lauderdale enforcing RF regulations for old buildings? Gary. You're in Fort Lauderdale. You're in Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah, I'm in Fort Lauderdale. I don't speak for the city, but I can tell you, yes, we are. But here's the caveat. With our fire marshal, we've worked out that unless they experience a problem in your building, either during an incident or during their yearly test, they are not going out and saying, hey, look, we're inspecting every building and you got to put this in. They're only doing that as needed.
Okay. Anybody else have anything to add on that?
We've seen that existing building requirement start to come into play in California, and it has been really a remodel building. If it hits a certain trigger in terms of valuation, it can cause existing buildings. To Gary's point, we've seen maybe some, for some reason, a building that has a critical element to it, maybe it's a huge building, single story, existing, but it's got a lot of chemicals in it or something that becomes, that flags that building to the AHJ where they're asking for it. We've seen in Las Vegas, because of after that active shooter where they are now requiring all existing buildings.
Yeah.
State of Florida is now, actually, they've got something in place now that is going to require all existing commercial high-rise to comply. And there are different dates depending on the type of vertical they are. But I believe it's coming. Even back to one of your first questions, Laurie, we've done a lot of speaking at Society of Fire Protection Engineering functions. And we're seeing more and more, you asked an attorney question, but actually I've been seeing more and more insurance groups show up there. Now that gives me an indication if the insurance companies are looking at that they're worried about it, right?
Absolutely. No question. And I know, in certain parts, just trying to understand where their direction's going, what codes that they're enforcing. I know Safer Buildings Coalition is a good resource to be able to get some of that information. And I know it's important because, these locations could change at any time, and it's interpretation, like you said. So why it's so important to be able to start that up and go to the authority first to be able to make sure that you have the right information to start with these complex systems. I'm just looking down through to see if there's any other questions, and I'm going to close it. We've got 4 minutes left. I'm going to close it with a group conversation. Kevin, I wanted to, get with you as well. Due to the fact that we see resources for these authorities, as we're telling everybody to go to the authorities and say, start there first, I know that they're resource challenged, so to speak. And I'm assuming based on that, we're seeing delays come out of that. What are you seeing as far as going to the authority for that information? How do you see that happening?
Very, very good question. I think, the authorities are already very busy before we even get on the subject of public safety. So, we need to realize that the plans review must be done by the fire marshal's office. So, this could be a real issue if they have some adequate resource issues. This can delay the final inspections, which can have a negative impact on the issuance of a certificate of occupancy. So there's kind of a common thread through the whole presentation that we gave the audience today, and that is remain humble if you're an integrator. Gary has been a great collaborator from an AHA perspective and works with everybody in the industry. He's learned a lot. He's taught us a ton. And so I really think it's being close with that AHJ, having the ability and past performance of frequency license coordination and AHJ coordination, and making sure that you're staying in your own swim lane. When you stay humble and you realize, well, I might not have a G roll or I might not have IB wave, put yourself together in a consortium of someone who can actually deliver that to Broward County, so that over the course of 4, 5, 10 projects, Gary's used to the particular quality of work that's coming out. And you're going to find that you're going to actually collaborate really closely with the AHJ to the point where you're actually getting things done quicker. If we have to go back and redo things because things were missed or things were made a mistake, this is mission critical life safety communication coverage. So, it's very complex, as Gary said, but at the same time, getting yourself, together with what you excel in and letting others to come help you synergize is really the goal here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. So we're coming to our time. I'm looking just to see if there's any other questions. There are quite a few, but I think we've answered a good portion. So other than that, anything to end on, guys? Maybe a quick 2-second from each.
I'll start off. Again, I have to emphasize, get with the AHJs, definitely get with the radio people, and start with them, get with the fire marshal, building inspectors for electrical and mechanical. They're all going to be involved in these projects. Like I said, they are construction projects, not just slap something on the wall. And that's where you have to start. And I'm lucky here in Fort Lauderdale. I used to do everything myself. We've got 2 new guys that hired on about a year ago, and they have taken a lot of that workload off my plate. So there are some jurisdictions that are stepping up and increasing manpower to handle this load. I know there are other jurisdictions that aren't as lucky as we are, and to them, I wish good luck.
So I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to real quick because we were running out of time. It's Bring Your Kids to Work Day. I brought them to work. So there's that. So I just wanted to make sure that happened. Unfortunately, it looks like we're out of time, but I do thank you all so much for doing what you do every single day. So informative, we could last for hours. I do want to also mention to the audience, we have another panel coming up. It's for edge computing. So hopefully everybody can join that next panel, and it's starting now. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and thank you for being so wonderful out there. Take care.
Thank you, Laurie.
everyone.
Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you.